Nā mana, nā reo, nā hoe whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Nā rangatira, I ngā hohoki, nā mihi nui a koutou. I wish I was with you in Sydney this morning, but COVID yet again has decided that the world will be somewhat different. I know that it's only 8:30 in the morning in Sydney, so can I just say how deeply impressed I am if there's actually anyone out there in the world who's watching this as I'm doing it live here in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. You know, I usually work with little ones, younger ones than the ones who are listening now. And the way I usually start is I'm going to tell some stories, and this morning I'm going to be telling you some stories. And I ask people, I ask the little ones to warm up their imaginations. And this was a wonderful little device I saw from colleagues and friends of mine in Canada, Juliana Saxton and Carol Miller, and I've been doing it for years. So I'm going to ask you to do it this morning. So I want you to put your hands out in front of you and rub your hands together. And when you've got them really, really nice and warm, I'm going to ask you to put your hands where you keep your imagination. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. Where have you put your hands to keep your imagination warm? You know, when I do this with little ones, they usually put their hands, or many of them put their hands on their heads. This idea that the imagination, that creativity is a thinking process. You know, neuroscientists reveal that, of course, there's no left and right brain activity when we're being creative, but the whole brain lights up. It's the most gorgeous thing when you watch those brain scans and you see people engaged in thinking creatively. It lights up like constellations in the heavens. Other children rub their hands and they put their hands on their hearts. This notion perhaps that the imagination sits as part of how we feel ourselves into the world. It's a sensorial, a sense-based response. This. And I often think when little children do this, that perhaps they understand that the imagination sits in the space between the head and the heart, between the cognitive and the affective, that the imagination makes us think, makes us feel, and is a thinking and a feeling process. Quite extraordinarily beautiful. I always remember, though, a boy, when I asked many years ago in a workshop that I was running to warm up his imagination, he rubbed his hands together and he went and put his hands on his legs. And I said, I asked, you keep your imagination in your legs? And he said, yes, Peter, I'm a dancer. And those of us in the arts know too that the imagination is embodied. It doesn't just sit in one part of who we are. You know, I struggle sometimes. You know, the Howard Gardner, the project that they've been doing up in the United States for years, and they talk about classrooms needing to be full of the creative brain. What about the creative arms, the creative legs, the creative body, the creative soul, the creative spirit? It's not just, I don't think it's not just there in the mind. Other little ones do this. Reach out. And they have a sense that the imagination is something which doesn't sit inside them, but it comes from somewhere else. And that what you need to do when you're warming up your imagination and to find your imagination is to be able to connect to it with others. That yes, the imagination is an individual attribute, an individual property of who we are as humans, but it's shared. And it's made bigger and made manifest when we share that with others. The Romantics, of course, understood, or thought they understood, that it came from the divine, that we reached to the ultimate creator for creativity. You know, in life and in schools, when I think about the importance of what we do as teachers, I imagine that the most important thing we might do as teachers is to make sure that children's creativity and imagination is warm. That we don't do, as Ken Robinson once said, you know, be in an education system that if we were to design one to kill creativity, we couldn't design one better than we have now. Because the reality is we did design this, both here in Aotearoa and there in Australia. This is what we live with, an education system that, rather than warming children's imagination, can dissipate it. Young people who feel that they are unable to reach and touch that most gorgeous of all things, the imagination. I'm a granddad, and so, you know, typical granddad, I'll bore you with some grandchildren stories now that your imagination's warm. You know, I've got a 2.5-year-old, nearly 3-year-old granddaughter. She spends her life imagining. And in lockdown here in Auckland, we're able to share our isolation bubbles with our daughter and son-in-law and our 2 grandkids. This week, I've been imagining, as I've held a piece of Lego that's a baby, that I'm able to breastfeed her, and my granddaughter asks me to help her go to sleep. The pretend that we're constantly engaged in the last couple of weeks is that in her house with her 9-month-old brother, 80% of the conversation hinges on sleep. So when we're with her, we're constantly pretending to be asleep, to go to sleep, to do all sorts of things. When I'm breastfeeding the piece of Lego, a dinosaur actually yesterday as well, she gave me the Lego and said, dinosaur, pop, pop, feed the dinosaur, put it on your bumpy. When she asked me to do that, I was thinking about that in terms of her learning. What was she trying to work out? She's trying to work out how you care for others and the way in which her mother and father and her grandparents care for her. She was learning the act of caring, of playing it out, of rehearsing it, of having a sense of what it means. You know, the great joy, of course, is that when children start at primary school, they come rich in play. Rich in social imagined play, which is what they've used to understand the world. You know, I watch my granddaughter do it now. She stands. No, she doesn't stand. She walks into my daughter's bedroom. She goes into her wardrobe and she puts on her mother's shoes, her mother's slippers. And she walks around in them. Why does she do that? Because that imagination, that superpower for learning, the imagination, when it's warm, and it's not just warm when you're 2.5, it's red, red, red hot. You use that to not just understand your mum, but to understand yourself as if you were your mum, to understand your relationship with your mum. Now, those of you who have daughters and understand the relationships between mothers and daughters, there's nothing trickier in the world to work out, is there? And what's the process that we have for that? It's the imagination. You know, we don't talk about the imagination enough in education, and it's important, it's vital, vital, vital importance. The other thing about the imagination when you're little is it gives you extraordinary joy. You make wonderful, beautiful things in and through your imagination. That's the arts. You know, John Dewey, the great education philosopher, said that the purpose of the arts was to train the imagination. I'm going to talk today about why I think that role for teachers to train the imagination, again, might be the most important thing we do as teachers. You know, the world we live in is pretty messed up, isn't it? In so many different ways, not just COVID, but climate change, corrupt politicians, a capitalism which is totally and completely out of control, a global greed that is destroying the planet, all those kinds of things. How do we get beyond the world in which we live? The great intergenerational promise of education, it seems to me, and what my father told me, was that you don't have to die in the same world in which you were born in, that the world for yourself and for others might be better. And at the heart of that is hope. Not hokey hope, but critical hope. The kind of hope that Paulo Freire talks about, the kind of hope which says that people need critical hope like a fish needs unpolluted water. And at the heart of all hope is the imagination. You know, schools make this mistake, and we make it often in this country. We talk about futures-focused curriculum. 3 words that should never be stuck together. Futures-focused curriculum. I think curriculum that's not focused, that's a bit blurry, ambiguous, that kind of you're never too sure what it is that you're going to end up learning before you've started, might be a really good idea. And futures-focused, damn it. You know, the trouble with the world is we can't make sense of it now. The great choice I think we have as educators, are we committing to schools being rehearsal rooms for the future? Or again, like John Dewey said, school is not preparation for the future. It's not preparation for life. It's life itself. And so we have this opportunity, I think, in schools, not to prepare children for the future, but to warm up their imagination. Use the imagination like they do when they're very little to make sense of the world, so that in doing that, they might imagine the world better and different. And most importantly, not just for themselves, but for others. It's a huge challenge for us as educators, isn't it? We have a system where we think the purpose of it is to prepare children for something. And in the global pandemic, the nonsense of that, in my mind, couldn't be made clearer. You know, my primary responsibility, I think, for children now living during COVID-19 is to help them make sense of the senseless world in which we live, and to use the arts and the imagination to help them do that. Because I don't know if I was preparing kids 5 years ago, if I was preparing them for COVID times, unless it was about helping them to imagine the world better and differently. I have spent a large part of my life making theatre, creating drama with young people and children all over the world in disasters and crises. I began in 2008 in China after the Sichuan earthquakes. You know, in China at that time, in the earthquakes, because of the poor quality of the school buildings, there were whole villages where not a single child was left. How do you imagine your way out of that? How do you find hope again? How do you find a way to make sense of what's happened in a way that nothing can make sense of? And that was my first real experience of working with artists who are doing that work. And then in 2011, I found myself in Christchurch 10 days after the earthquake, which killed 185 people. You know, the promise was that when schools reopened, Christchurch would go back to normal. It's a bit like COVID. We're never going back to normal, are we? We're never going back to what once was. Things have changed forever. And things changed forever in Christchurch. I'm just going to tell a tiny little part of the story of the work that I did there. I worked in the morning on the first day back with a group of little children, warmed up their imaginations, and we played with a story. And the story was of a little girl who wakes up and her dream cloth is torn. And the children decide that with the dream cloth torn, all the colours in your life would drain away, and it would be a sad story. And when you ask 6 and 7-year-olds if they'd like to help the little girl in the story, they always say yes. Those of you who teach at 5, 6 and 7, you know, you ask children if they'll help. They don't go, oh, I don't know, it might create a culture of dependency, or maybe I've got no right to. If I ask my PhD students if they think they can help people, they go, I don't think I'm qualified. But when you're 5, 6 or 7, because your imagination's so warm, you can imagine you can help other people. You can imagine you know enough to do it. And that's what they did. They helped the little girl in the story, and the way in which they helped the little girl in the story was to repair her dream cloth. They drew their own dreams on a cloth as well, and they drew pictures of children on unicorns flying over the land of everything that's good. And then they decided to make a magic thread. And in making that magic thread, it would be powerful enough, a superpower, if you think, to repair dreams. You know, we live in a world where our dreams have been torn so badly. And you ask a 6 and 7-year-old and they know what it takes. We stood around a pretend cloud bowl that they'd made, myself, the children and the teachers who were watching me teach. And they poured the ingredients into the bowl, bales of belief, pieces of love, laughter. And then one little girl said, Peter, you'll need one last thing. You'll need a teaspoon of light from the darkest tunnel. And I asked her, how do you put a teaspoon of light into the bowl? And she stood on her tiptoes and she said, you sprinkle it and see, the light goes through everything. And we all looked and we imagined she was right. It did go through everything. See, with her imagination warm, she could imagine an answer. She could imagine a way of moving from today into the future. She could imagine that was possible with just a teaspoon of light sprinkled the right way. You know, I ended up doing a UNESCO-funded project in Christchurch for a number of years where I worked in those schools. And the research that I did when I talked to teachers and principals, one of the things that I discovered and unpacked was that although the earthquake had literally changed the landscape, it didn't change what teachers taught. Changed a little bit how they taught. There was more of a focus on well-being, but the actual things that they taught. And I realized there was a curriculum gap. There was a gap where after crisis, after disaster, we didn't necessarily have, or teachers didn't necessarily have the resources, the pedagogical curriculum resources to support what they did. And I've been working for the last 10 years to shift and change that. You know, I've ended up in all sorts of different places. I ended up in Mexico City after a disaster. I took teaspoon of light process, cucharera de luz, in Spanish, and worked that across the most quake affected parts of Mexico City. In January of last year, I found myself in Sydney. The sky was black. Dust was choking people. And I remember people in Sydney wearing masks then because of the dust. And teachers wondering and worrying about what they would do when children came back. And they understood the futility and the nonsense of futures-focused curriculum, that actually what you needed to do was to help children make sense of the world now. And then in March of last year, we found ourselves facing COVID for the first time. And we went into a very strict lockdown here in Auckland. And during that lockdown, I put together with a group of extraordinary academics and colleagues and friends, including Robin Ewing from the University of Sydney, John O'Toole, and Julie Dunn from Melbourne and Griffith University, and a whole group of scholars and artists, a website to help teachers help children return after lockdown. And what I want to show you, and I'm just going to ask our colleagues and friends to show you, is the opening video that opens up the Te Rito Toi website. So I'm hoping that was a really nice kind of introduction to that video. Te Rito Toi was established during COVID-19. Its purpose really to help teachers and students return to the classroom following the disasters and crisis of the pandemic. It uses the arts as the way to re-engage with learning, to catch up not with work, but to catch up with each other, to establish an ethic of care, to establish a way of being with each other, which reinforces the notion that at the heart of all teaching is the human relationship. The possibility of using the arts to re-engage with the emotions, to re-engage with each other, is vital for schools after crisis. Te Rito Toi is research-informed, practice-led, designed with and alongside teachers and experts in arts education, trauma-informed pedagogies. It's a one-stop shop for teachers to think about how they're going to respond to the issues, the concerns, the worries, the anxieties of children as they return to school after life-changing events. When children come back after crisis, they need to come back to the joy and the wonder of learning. And it's the arts that provide that in a unique way. So we say, come back to school through the arts, because that's the way back to living. Thank you, my friends. That was beautifully timed, wasn't it? You did such a great job. So we put Te Rito Toi out into the world. We were very lucky. We were supported by the New Zealand Principals Federation, NZEI, the New Zealand Primary Teachers Union, which represents over 90% of all primary teachers in New Zealand, the Sir John Kirwan Foundation, UNESCO New Zealand, and all the art subject associations. So that when we launched Te Rito Toi, that curriculum gap that I talked about was filled. In the first month, the site was downloaded over 250,000 times. It's now being downloaded close to 400,000 times in 140 countries around the world. And I've run webinars on Te Rito Toi with over 40,000 teachers. The scale of the uptake told me that it's a deeply useful, practical resource, because what it does is it brings children back after lockdowns, after crisis. We're at the heart of what we do. It's not catching up with lost work, but catching up with relationships, coming back slowly, not quickly. I know in Sydney, and I can hear the voices of the people pushing it, is that because you've lost time, you're going to have to catch up with what they lost in their learning. It's a nonsense. It seems to me that what we need to remember when schools reopen is that the first and primary responsibility for us as teachers is to ensure that young people feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally in their return to physical and social engagement with others. That when they enter into that room with all their worries, concerns, and fears of what's happened and the way in which everyone's life has been changed, that's a safe place to think, feel, and express that. And that the best way in which you can do that with children is through the superpower of the arts, the superpower of the imagination. That you work with story, you work with picture books, you work with drama, music, dance, visual arts. That's the way back. You know, Auckland's been in a 9-week lockdown, and I know that's nothing on what people have been doing in Melbourne or in Sydney of late. You know, we thought we'd kicked it, didn't we? Us in Sydney and Auckland. It's really come back. We'll be going back when Auckland schools reopen through Te Rito Toi, this time in partnership with the Ministry of Education here, with a recognition that the most important thing that we can do when we reopen schools is to focus on student wellbeing, is to focus on ways to create possibilities for them, not to engage in a rehearsal for the future, but to think about, to feel about with others the changed world in which they live. Last year we did some research on schools that had really embraced Te Rito Toi as a way back after lockdowns. We talked to teachers and principals. You know, one of the things that has really struck me was that was a number of teachers who said that the primary fear that young people returned to school with wasn't about loss of learning or any of those things. It was fear that their parents and grandparents were going to die of COVID, and then what would happen to them. So that's what returns to classrooms. That's what floods in. How do you deal with that? How do you think about that? How do you work through that? And I think that's why Te Rito Toi has been so popular, so important, because it provides research-informed and research-led ways of understanding what it is that you might do to work with that. You know, we work with a lovely story called Aroha's Way. And Aroha is a little girl that develops what she calls butterflies in her stomach because she can't name the anxiety that seems to crowd her in. And we use that story as a way for children to talk not about themselves, but through the fiction, talk about Aroha, and in doing so, address the issues facing themselves. And that's been enormously popular. We have a new storybook that you're most welcome in Australia to use. It's Tūmeki the Tuatara. Now, Tuatara are a reptile that's only found here in New Zealand, and Tūmeki means choice. Well done, great in the Māori language. But it's a story about how the Tuatara, who's terribly, terribly sad and anxious, overcomes that by being kind to others. It's a beautiful story to do with children. Most gorgeous story to do with children, because at its heart, it suggests that there is a way to overcome where you are in the world without it being taught. Use drama and the arts and music and dance to explore tūmeki and the tuatara. You get right to the very heart, I think, of how so many children are feeling at the moment. So, Te Rito Toi provides the space for dialogue, which is what the arts have always done. Dialogue about deeply important things. So today, you know, I'm very much aware that schools will be reopening across New South Wales. And when they do, thinking about how you're going to reopen. For those of you who are thinking about the books that you will use, the stories that you will use, have a look at Te Rito Toi. There's some lovely stories there. Robin Ewing helped curate the picture books in there that you can use, that connect to the kinds of ideas. There's some lovely ones. And one of my brain's a bit scattered at Saturday morning after all. There's lovely ones there about being brave. It's time to have conversations with children about what it means to be brave. Time to have conversations about what it means to be brave when you're scared. Because I don't know about you, but that's how I feel. And I'm not 7 or 8. I'm an old fella. And I'm trying to be brave when I'm scared about the world. And in the fiction, you know, fiction's always served that purpose. That's its superpower, isn't it? Fictional worlds help us to understand our real worlds in ways that when we warmed up our imagination and we imagine that it's sat somewhere between our heads and our hearts, that's where stories grab us, isn't it? In the space between our heads and our hearts, and they move into our bodies. And then it's the power of sharing them with others. God, what a joy. You know, you have an enormous responsibility as teachers going back after lockdowns, after crisis. You know, one of the things that we know about crisis, about COVID, is that it layers across other traumas. You know, where's it hit in Auckland? It's hit in South Auckland, in our poorest, most marginalised, vulnerable Indigenous communities. It layers in over the top of poverty, of job insecurity, of a housing crisis. It layers in over, in the last 9 weeks of lockdown, a once in 100-year flood that destroyed homes, and a terror attack in a supermarket where people were stabbed with knives. It sits in amongst the media exposure where 7 and 8-year-olds are hearing on the news, sitting next to their parents, or hearing on the radio that Delta's more deadly than the previous variant. So that notion of COVID, like all crisis, re-inscribing the social fault lines and layering over the top, means that teachers who work in those schools have got really hard jobs ahead. And those of you working in higher socioeconomic areas, you know, we have lost so many jobs here in Auckland. We've lost, you know, that job security is gone, and families that thought their lives and their worlds were settled have been tipped on their ends, tipped on their heads, and their children have so many questions. And what they desperately need is an informed, caring, loving teacher to help them through it. So the fiction that we use in Te Rito Toi helps with that. But the other 2 things that we found in our research that was so important was that teachers also realise that in the arts, when you're drawing with children or painting with them or making some theatre with them or singing with them and laughing with them as you make, And we've known this for years in the arts. It changes the relationships. And a different kind of talk is possible. So one of the lovely things about when you're doing things with your hands, not just warming your imagination, but you're making things, you're able to have parallel conversations. And teachers in our study last year talked about, if you're making things with children and you're sitting with them, it provides an opportunity for dialogue. So one teacher in our study last year talks about sitting and making some matchstick dolls with children, and a young child saying, just out of nowhere, because they were making together, what if granddad dies? Now, you know, there are big questions, aren't there, in life that children need answers to. Teachers need to feel confident and competent that they can think about and answer them. Te Rito Toi provided that space. So yes, the fiction, the parallel activity, and then others talked about the safety inherent in children coming back and just having fun, just playing together again, just being together and making beautiful things. Whether that beautiful thing is a tune sung together, a lovely piece of drama that makes us laugh or cry or wonder, or a blaze and a splash of colour on a piece of paper. You know, the arts have always been two things at the same time: a way to escape from the world for a moment so that we might breathe a little more easily, and a way to come closer to the world. It's a great paradox of the arts. It brings us closer to the world because we can see the world more clearly through fiction, but it's also a way to escape for it in the moment. So when kids come back, please, in New South Wales, don't rush it. Don't go charging back. Don't believe this nonsense that somehow kids have lost learning. My God, they've learned an enormous amount in the last couple of months. We all have. There's no rush. I'm writing a book at the moment called The Joy of Slow Wonder, The Joy of Slow Teaching. Go back, be slow, take time to build relationship, to rebuild relationship between you and the children and the children and the children and the children and their families. There'll be nothing more important that you can do. And if that's all you manage between now and Christmas, pat yourself on the back. We're living in a goddamn pandemic, and it's hard work. And we've got to look after each other. And that's the primary concern, not preparing them for the next year's learning, whatever that might mean. I'm deeply impressed that you're up so early this morning on a Saturday morning listening to me. I wish all of you who are heading back into schools over the coming weeks all the best. For those of you who have been in there over the last months, working with children and working with children's fears, my very best to you as well. You know, when I think of that little girl, and I think of her so often in Christchurch, who offered a teaspoon of light from the darkest tunnel, there's a couple of things that spring immediately to my mind. One is she understood where the most powerful light comes from. Doesn't come at the end of the tunnel. Like Kierkegaard, she understood that the stars shine at night because of the blackness of the sky. That the most powerful light comes in the darkest of places, in the middle of the tunnel. And in COVID, we're in the middle of the tunnel, and it's our job as teachers to help children find those teaspoons of light. And it's our job as teachers to recognize that we do have agency. That little girl understood that all you need is a teaspoon, not a huge amount, just a teaspoon of light is enough. It's how we sprinkle it. It's how we spread it. You know, the arts are a superpower for learning, but it's quality, loving, caring, teaching, which is the superpower. And ngā mihi nui a koutou, ngā rangatira, e ngā hōhoki, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I've done extraordinarily well. I said to myself I'd speak for 40 minutes, and I've done that with a minute over.